Okay, welcome everyone on all our different platforms, hopefully. We are going to start the program in a couple of minutes. Very nice to see you all. What I might do now is just give you a slightly more interesting view. So this is a piece by Philip Moore, Baton Ball Fantasy, 1965. Rupert has it as 1968, so I'm not quite sure which it is. But it's a piece I'm going to talk about a little bit in the introduction. So it just may be of interest to look at while we continue to admit people and wait for the start. Philip Moore's carvings slightly less well known, I think, than some of his paintings.
It actually is pretty interesting to hear someone who works in the restaurant industry not necessarily wanting to see restaurants open up for indoor dining again because of the safety concerns for people, especially that are working there.
I think, everybody has different opinions, and what the pandemic really has done is to...
Okay, Hannah, we may want to just mute. Thank you.
With the correct leadership, and we going back and forth many times, so we don't have one approach, and it shows that people's going to respond to this very differently, and the learning practice everything in Detroit, and I think it will be different in different communities. And what I could say, as working and living and having my restaurant in that majority Black and Brown community, which are the communities that are hit the worst, and right now, and proportionally, it's always been harder to get access to funding from banks and so on. And
Stan is here. he was keeping us in suspense.
He's coming through on the rails.
Yes.
Yeah. Find it
okay,
insane.
So let me now find him.
I fully respect that. Some people go back to work, you shouldn't go back to work.
It is obvious because your restaurant is an institution. It's historical in the city. There are a lot of restaurants that don't necessarily have that standing as the Red Rooster does. How have you guys been through all this? How have you been surviving?
Okay, we have somebody's audio. Could we mute that, please?
To the restaurant and myself. So we've done two things. I partnered with Jose Andres and What's Up Kitchen, and we stopped serving March 15. Between March 15 and October 15, we became a community kitchen.
Thank you. Okay, I think we're close enough to the start to begin. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Isabel de Carys. I am the Chair of Trustees at Moray House Trust and the moderator for this event. Welcome to our 5th virtual event, Philip Moore and Appreciation. For those joining us for the first time tonight, Moray House Trust is a private, non-partisan, non-profit based in Georgetown and dedicated to promoting Guyanese culture and public discourse. A warm Guyanese welcome to our regulars. Please note that this event is being live streamed via Facebook and YouTube. If you are on Zoom and would prefer not to be visible, please turn off your video on the bottom left of the Zoom screen. Please also please also mute yourself. Two apologies. There was a small typo in some of the emails sent out to the mailing lists, and we inadvertently added almost a decade to Philip Moore's life. He died in 2012, not 2021. And the time stated on the flyer, I'm a bit concerned about this, may have been a bit confusing. So that was apologies from me on both fronts, my errors. Now to Philip Moore. Can we admit, please, sorry. My co-hosts can do that as well. If Philip is widely acknowledged as a genius, the exact nature of his genius is inscrutable to many of us. We look at his work as though through a mist, seeing it, but not perceiving it. We can see its outlines, but its context, its cultural frames of reference are obscure. Partly this is due to the fact that complex societies such as ours include within them subsets with very different cultural references, very different sensibilities, very different ways of thinking and perceiving. Partly also, in Moore's case, there is an additional challenge, the scope and the nature of his genius. Many works of art echo a particular school or a recognized style. They exist within established frames of reference. Moore's work does not. It is wholly original. He seems to distill an entire cosmos into each work of art. Each work is a self-contained galaxy of meaning. By way of example, let's look briefly at Baton Ball Fantasy, the first piece that brought Moore international recognition. It's clear, even to a layman like me, that this is a technical feat. But what does it mean? What does it signify? In his essay, Philip Moore of Guyana and the Universe, Rupert Roopnarine explains. And I'm just going to move to a slightly more detailed view. Baton Ball Fantasy simply tells everything there is to tell about cricket in the quarantine when Moore was a child. Growing up in Manchester, famous for its ground and cricketers, he was nurtured in the thick of those deep and all-encompassing inter-village contests. Wim versus Manchester was no mere cricket match. In ways that CLR James would have keenly appreciated, it was a conflict of civilizations fought out in a remote corner of the British Empire. The carving is framed along its four sides. Along the top, 10 heads represent the 10 golden hours of sunshine. Just going to show a close-up there of the top and the bottom. Along the bottom, the roller used to prepare the pitch. Along the two sides, the spectators clapping their hands, now for the fielding side, now for the batsman, and then at the end, all cheering for the game. The central figure is a man batting, bowling, fielding, umpiring, and cheering. Two arms upraised. The right hand grips the ball. The left waves the flag. Two other arms end in the bat and the umpire's two sticks. One flecked with the blood that can flow from the fights which would follow a crucial decision. The anatomy of the figure is made up of bat, stumps, pitch pads. The holes and vertical marks stand respectively for the bowlers and fielders straining to get the batsman out, and the batsmen fighting to score their runs. The sinews of the arms are twisted to impact a wicked wrist spin. In the space around the neck of the figure, cups and a pot stand for the refreshments, a not so minor aspect of things. The overall design is wonderfully harmonious and provides a point of tension with the turbulence it depicts. The intricacy and minuteness of detail, I'm going to just show you a couple others here, similar ones, would become a more hallmark. Later on at Princeton, they would call it filigree. To complete the depiction of the phenomenon that was the Wim versus Manchester match, a small coffin and a fowlcock with a smear of blood. What have these to do with a game of cricket? They make reference to the obia dimension and tell a village tale. A certain Johnson Court, doing work for Manchester, would walk into the Wim ground carrying his coffin to capture the spirits of the Wim players and tie them down. Johnson Court was the agent of Uncle Hackett, known and feared as Jumby Coney, the obia man for Manchester. The work for the opposite side was performed by Kali Ram, the obia man in charge of the Kali Church in Letterkenny, a nearby village. The night before the game, the players would leave their homes and sleep at the safe house of the manager, Georgie Gray. There, they were to be called only by their false names, so that when the spirits came calling their names at night, they would not call their right names. For the avoidance of doubt on the day of the match, pork would be burned in a capstan cigarette tin on the wind side of the ground to keep away the Kuli Jumbi, which had no liking for the smell of burning pork fat. All these things claim their place in the small 3-foot by 18-inch carving. It is a miracle of distillation and symbolic expression. And those are all the words of Rupert Roopnarine in his essay about Philip Moore. Perhaps now, when we look again at the carving, we are a little closer to perceiving it. Perhaps too, as we listen to the interplay of the 3 different critical perspectives this evening, we will make the shift from seeing to perceiving. A word or two to explain the format for this event. Each member of the panel will speak for about 15 minutes, and then the panel will discuss Moore's work. Afterwards, we will invite questions and comments from the floor. When we get to the Q&A segment, please use the raise your hand icon on Zoom if you'd like to ask a question. For those following on Facebook or YouTube, please use the chat option. Our first speaker this afternoon is Alim Hosein. Alim is a senior lecturer in the Department of Language and Cultural Studies at the University of Guyana. His presentation is entitled Connecting Philip Moore. Over to you, Alim.
Thank you, Isabel, and good evening, everyone. I hope you can see my presentation up now. Yes. Okay, so my talk is called Connecting Philip Moore, and it includes and will touch on some of the things that Isabel mentioned in that excellent introduction from Rupert Roopnarine. I'm going to talk a little bit about Guyanese history, touching on such things as Obia and Kalimai, and then I will connect that to Philip Moore's work, some of his works from the 1950s and 60s. So this, in a sense, will flesh out some of the things that Rupert pointed to, that Philip embodied in his painting, in his piece of work, Baton Ball Fantasy. So here goes. Philip, as we all know, is a very complex person, and he's been described in many different ways as a naive, primitive, atavistic, visceral, intuitive, untutored, African, spiritual, many different kinds of descriptions of Philip. Dennis Williams, who is familiar with African art, was able to point to some characteristics of West African sculpture, sacred sculpture, and connect Philip to that. And here's a quote from Dennis Williams. He says that Philip's work, he was talking about the 1763 monument, has the features of the sacred sculpture of West Africa, the immateriality, the spirituality, the proportions, and the frontality and emphasis on the face. But Dennis Williams also recognized some of the problems in connecting Philip specifically to Africa, because he also pointed out that there was a disconnection, a fracture. When the Africans left Africa to come to Guyana, and of course, many of them were born in Guyana, they lost contact with that African tradition to some extent. And so Dennis says that when the Africans were brought to the Caribbean, the art became antique, and those forms would not have been able to persist. So that when Philip Moore begins to carve, he's using a technical language, the ability to carve, not the iconological language, since he has lost the symbols and the imagery and the forms and so on of African art. Errol Brewster, trying to connect Philip also, says that also connects him to Africa, to the African continent and the African traditions. But Errol uses words like magic and miracles and so on to connect Philip to this great African tradition. So this was the problem that I looked at, because I had done some interviews with Philip while he was alive, and I was rereading some of them that I had done in 1995 and 1996 that were published. And I found some interesting things that Philip himself said about his African roots. While he admitted to being an African-inspired artist, and there's no doubt about that in his work, in the actual works that he produced and in his thinking, Philip had a more complex understanding of his Africanness. And he said, my works may have African motifs, but they have a universal appeal. If you look at Black Friday, for example, it might look African, but it's about humanity. Even the 1763 monument, and he was a bit upset that people were sidelining the universal and humanistic aspects of his art in favor of the African aspect of the art. So he had said this many times to me and also to other persons that he spoke with. And of course, here again, it's another quote where he's upset about this whole Africanness that some people talk about. The people who belong to the African organizations, and they talk about the African man and the African drum, but they have to understand that the subconscious is the talking drums within them, and that they can use their creative imagination to become the things that they want to be. So Philip was going far beyond mere Africanness. And he said, there's an ancient soul. He was birthed in Africa, in the country of Guyana, and the universe. And he felt that he was timeless and ever existed and deathless. Others have written about the spiritual aspect of Moore's work, such as Stanley Graves and Bernadette Prasad. And then Philip also had talked about his readings in mythology, all of this that would add to his work and his thinking. So my question is, how do we locate Philip within the context of Guyana in this historical time when he was born? Was he isolated from and immune to the influences of the actual world around him in the quarantine, living among the grassroots Africans and East Indians? So in doing my reading on the history of Guyana, this period after 1834, 1838, after emancipation, and into the 1950s was a very important part of Guyanese history and development of culture, because that is where we began developing what Guyana is becoming, has become, and will become after freedom for the slaves, and then the importation of Chinese, Portuguese, other Europeans, other people from the Caribbean, and of course, East Indians. So we had all of those currents going on. Moore was born in 1921. And so what kind of society did he enter? As I was saying, there are many economic, spatial, educational, social issues as the freed Africans tried to establish themselves, as the Portuguese tried to establish themselves, the Chinese and the incoming East Indians from 1834, 1835, 1845, and so on. And in terms of cultural development, there were two main currents that are important in looking at Philip, I think. One was the Eurocentric Christian culture, which was the standard, which was the pathway to progress. This was the one that the mixed population was heading towards. And this was the one exemplified by the few whites who were still in Guyana, the colonial administration that was still in Guyana. And some of the Portuguese also aspired to this. But you notice that even the Portuguese were ejected from this because they were treated as a separate people, not as whites. And so this was the one tradition, and this was the accepted, the standard, the way for progress and to achieve social success. But beyond that was the grassroots tradition, which was looked down upon and considered to be backward. And this was the tradition of the Africans and the East Indians, the Madrasis, and the others that came here. And the important thing is that despite the pressure of the standard Eurocentric tradition, the grassroots tradition continued to be alive, and Moore was very important in that. Now, briefly, there's a lot that I can talk about in terms of these traditions, but in terms of time, I'll have to be very brief. The African traditions, although we think that there was a break from Africa to Guyana, the African traditions still continued in the form of what the whites called Obi or Obia, which was a catch-all term. Now, Obia is not necessarily a bad thing, but it was used to refer to any of the African traditions, whether it was herbalism, spiritualism, or whatever it was called Obia. So the whites had a problem with this, and from the 1700s, those were the earliest written records I could find, and into the 1800s and the 1900s, there were many proclamations by the authorities and even the court of policy banning Obia, and there were trials for people practicing Obia and so on. And it was said to be prevalent, and it was the profession of Obia practiced among the Negroes. Now, from the 1880s, there was also much activity among the Hindus and Muslims to reconnect to India. There were many visiting scholars. There was the establishment of schools and religious organizations in Guyana, Trinidad, and Suriname. From the 1920s, there was a resurgence of Hinduism, in particular the Arya Samaj, that is the Brahmin tradition, and later the Sanatanists, Sanatan Dharma, which was the more grassroots Indian tradition that became very active. And the same thing happened for the Muslims, and the same thing happened for the Madrasis in the establishment of the Kalimite Church, which continued to exist even though the Madrasi population declined. Now, what was important was that these traditions had crossovers. The African traditions were different from the original African versions. They were syncretized with the practices of other groups with whom the Africans came into contact. And the Africans had been absorbing from the whites, the Portuguese, the Chinese, the Amerindians even before the East Indians began. And they also absorbed from the East Indians after the East Indians began. And there were a number of grassroots religions like Mayaism, Komina, Revival Zion, Comfa, Shango, spiritual baptism, etc., throughout the Caribbean. And another one that was important in Guyana is the Jordanites, which began in 1882 in Trinidad. But this began when Joseph McLaren had a discussion with a man named Maharaj, an East Indian man who was setting up a Hindu church. So McLaren, a Christian, was influenced by Maharaj, an East Indian. He came to Berbice and established a church in 1895, which after a time faded away and was revived in 1917 by Nathaniel Jordan. And so we have the Jordanite name. Continuing, now, Jordanites borrowed from Christianity, from Hinduism, Islam, and Kali Mai, and even from Guyanese folk traditions, and recognized the Bible, the Quran, and the Gita. Now, it believed in the celestial realm of God and Jesus and the angels and so on, but it also believed in a terrestrial realm where you have the deities. And who were these deities? These deities were the Indian deities, such as Lakshmi and Durga, and even Amerindian and Chinese deities and so on. Now, Moore joined the Jordanites in 1940, and he became a Grand Master. He married the daughter of a Jordanite elder, and he received inspiration from the clouds in the same way that Nathaniel Jordan had received his initiation. Now, I'll try quickly to connect some of Philip's work to this tradition. Now, Philip himself said in 1996 that he was interested in the Arya Samaj religion, and he made a study of all of these things, and he did a carving. This is one example that survived of Mahatma Gandhi from the 1950s. I will come back to this in a minute. And he said that all of these things that he was studying from the 1950s, he put them in the 1763 monument. And I will show you an example of that. Now, to show you that he wasn't just talking off the top of his head, he mentioned this guy, Bhaskar Anand. And Bhaskar Anand was an actual Hindu missionary who came to Guyana in 1936 and stayed until 1945, who before Moore became a Jordanite. And he was very active across Guyana, setting up the Aryan League in British Guyana and establishing a school, the Oriental College. And he was the Vedic Bishop of Guyana and the West Indies. So he was very active and very popular. And Philip certainly heard about him and remembered him 60 years later to tell me about him. Now, another thing that shows that Philip's awareness, he spoke about the calendars, the pictures and the murtis that the Hindus had in their houses and their temples, calendars and postcards of Ganesh and Krishna and so on. And he said that Africans too have to get their spiritual heroes. Now, Bisnath, Dale Bisnath, the historian, pointed out that in the 1920s, after the revival of Hinduism, religious pictures imported from India were used as part of the way of resuscitating and reviving Hinduism in Guyana. And so from the 1920s, you had these calendars and postcards and so on that Hindus were putting up in their homes with the Hanuman and Krishna and all of that. And Philip Moore told me about that. And he told Rupert Surrey about that in 2012. So these are things that he absorbed from the land around him. Now, coming back to the Gandhi sculpture. Now, he has Gandhi with his hand here. Now, this is called a mudra, which is a hand signal. And this is the Abhaya mudra, to dispel fear and to give protection. Philip Moore put a shield on the chest of Coffee. And what was this chest? What was this shield to do? It's the breastplate of protection in battle. So a kind of link we can make. We can hypothesize a link between what Philip Moore did in the 1950s and what he did again in the 1970s in two different pieces of work. He also carved a medallion of the Hindu god Hanuman from the 1950s, depicting Hanuman crossing the oceans to go to Lanka to rescue Sita. And Philip Moore looked at this as the Hindus crossing the oceans to come to Guyana. I have a bigger picture here. So he has Philip Moore, he has Hanuman, the Indian god, Hindu god, crossing the oceans with a depiction of the Hindus and Guyana here in his hand. So all of these things Philip did. Baton ball fantasy that Isabel's and Rupert spoke about, we can make a kind of link. We can suppose a link between the shape. Now remember, Dennis Williams had said that Philip Moore had lost contacts with the shapes and the icons and the motifs of African art. So where did he get some of his ideas from? He was familiar, we know, with these Indian works. And so we have the same kind of shape with the feet and the arms and the many arms and the surrounding of the Shiva Nataraja. And we could make tentatively some kinds of connections there. We also have a painting of Philip Moore himself, a psychic portrait from 1968 with the third eye. Now we see in Hindi and Nepali and other Indian Hindu traditions, we see the third eye. And we see it also in African masks, a third eye. Now this third eye, the Hindus call it the tilak or the bindi. Now it is applied to the point of the Ajna chakra, and that is linked to creativity and awareness and intellect and understanding and so on, which are things that Philip exemplified and exposed. And the Africans also call it the third eye, the eye of inspiration and insight. Now, another thing is that Philip talked about his work. In 1995, he told me that when he does his carving, he holds the work in his hands and he thinks about the problems of society that is in his mind. And then he carves it. So he becomes a conduit. And so he thinks about the problems of society and he carves it. And so he transmits it into the work to form a kind of mental stability. Now, Bernadette Prasad reminds us of the yoga technique of Samprajnata. Samprajnata is similar to what Philip was talking about. And that is concrete meditation. You recognize the contents of your mind in the same way that Philip is talking about, thinking about problems of society. And then you release it consciously in the same way that he releases it. He says, I engrave it on the wood. And then it forms for him. It forms an ease for him, a kind of mental stability. And Samprajnata leads to this mental stability or this clarity and self-awareness. So there's a direct link, whether Philip knew about Samprajnata or not. There's a direct link between Samprajnata and what he did. And so this is Samprajnata. It's a meditation, being aware of the outside world and so on. Now, this is what Philip told me in 1995, that he said he knew that people would come to understand more if they studied religions, especially the Hindu religion. And he himself, at an early age, became a vegetarian, like many Hindus, and he learned the art of meditating. So, all of this I tie up into this historical tradition that I was telling you about, the grassroots tradition. Now, while these traditions of Obeah, Hinduism, Islam, Kali Mai and Jordanites and so on were being practiced, there was great pressure from the Eurocentric traditions for the grassroots people to quote unquote improve themselves. There was Joseph Rohoman in 1894 who gave a lecture. Sorry, my screen sharing has gone. Okay, let me get back to it. Yes, so there was lots of pressure from people like Joseph Rohoman, who talked about improving yourself. And there was IRF Rebbe E.F. Fredericks, who incidentally was the president of the Negro Progress Convention. There were schoolmasters and so on, all of them calling on grassroots Indians and Africans to quote unquote improve themselves. Now, Brian Moore, the historian, the Guyanese historians, tells us that from the latter 1800s, Creole Blacks had been indoctrinated to believe that they were inferior and that they had to advance themselves. But advancement meant cultural self-denial. Now, Philip Moore was born into this, and Philip Moore championed this. Philip Moore never thought of himself as having to improve himself, and he was part of the tradition. And he was a great champion of this tradition in which he believed implicitly, and his entire life was a demonstration of this, and was a way of championing the spirit in all of us and our grassroots, going back to Africa, going back to India, China, Portugal, or wherever we may have come from. And so that is how I connect Philip Moore and all the works that he did from the 1950s and subsequently, including the 1763 monument. And so I hope that this gives you a wider context of Philip within Guyanese history. So as Isabel said, we can think about him and approach, and we can start to perceive instead of just look and react. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That was wonderful. Thank you very much. Okay, we move on now to Stanley Graves. Stanley Graves is a Guyanese poet, a sculptor, painter, educator, writer, and classical guitarist. He's also a contemporary of Philip Moore's, and he's going to speak now. Stan, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, good. I usually refer to this thing as white people obia. You know, you press buttons and all kind of funny things go on. Yes, Alim, thanks you very much for your historical perspectives. A lot of research obviously went into your talk.
Thank you very much.
Yes, I'm going to take a kind of anti-historical approach. So I'm going to talk from a personal level. In 1948, I went to the Promenade Gardens, where they held a thing called the LCP Fair, the League of Colored Peoples, which was actually a kind of connection to the Garveyism that was going on at the time. And the LCP was really organized by a Dr. Nicholson. So at that fair, people used to put out their merchandise and things like that. And I was 11 years old then, and I saw a tent where there were these little wooden carvings. And of course, being interested in things like that, I wondered, first of all, who made these strange looking things and what kind of tools did he use? In 1948, I joined the Working People's Art class, and I did meet Philip then. And Philip was sitting and he was carving and he was speaking, which was a lifelong thing of Philip Moore. He always was speaking while he was working. Lost track of Philip. 1968 was the next time I came into contact with Philip, which was when he was about to go to Princeton, and he was going to be there as artist in residence. And I thought that was something good for Guyana because he was going to be operating at an international level. Met Philip again in the 1970s when he was sculpture tutor at the Borough School of Art. And that's where I really got to listen to Philip. One had to listen to Philip because I'm convinced that Philip was an eternal monologue. You know, Philip is going to be pushing material at you and keep talking, and you have to try to get your questions in and get him to answer you. One of the first things Philip used to talk about was this question of when he first got involved in spiritualism. And he spoke about this hand. I'm going to be using, I did write an article on him in the Arts Journal in 2012, sometime like that. Philip spoke about 103. This hand, a black hand holding a gouge, reached down from a golden cloud. And this was accompanied by a message telling him to be an artist. This hand was something that appeared quite a lot in Philip's work. And I did not realize that in my own work, I was doing the same thing until one of my daughters told me, what are all these hands doing in your work? Well, that's an easy connection because I like making things. So this black hand was reaching out, was a kind of a deliverance. And this was exemplified in the tale of Moses relieving the 10 Commandments. You know, he's receiving something which was coming from a cosmic source. And then he went on to say, he had an epiphany. A voice came to him. A wind came and encircled me and said, so long you wanted to carve a man's head out of wood, get up and do it. And so he got his cutlass, and he got a piece of wood, and he carved the head. Now, what interested me was this fact that this wind, a wind came, and that wind is something that you find spoken about quite a lot in metaphysics and also in books on spiritualism. The French even have a word for it, which they call a tourbillon. And it is a kind of energy, a cosmic energy, which descends on you, and you receive energy from it, which you're then able to use in what it is you're doing. And that heavenly wind is also described in some places as a pneuma, or breath, and the breath of God. You are in direct connection with God when you are involved either in the tourbillon or when you receive this breath. The thing about these two experiences of Philip Moore, I feel, are genuine, and I think they form the foundation of all of his subsequent work and all of his subsequent beliefs. Because it is, to my mind, it is definite that he did receive these things, and therefore it gave him an information at a certain level that is not open to all of us. We are not all that receptive. Then there is talk about this epiphanies. You talk about his readings. Philip liked to boast about his reading, how many things he's read and what have you. He said here that he had a library. I have a library of magical books. I have read the most and best on Egyptian religion and philosophy. I'm widely read, you know. And another discussion with him another time, he said that I have about 24 volumes about man, myth, and magic. I have all the greatest books of power, deliverance, and magical law. And at the time, he was quoting a number of books, and I had to tell Philip, I said, Philip, I've read a number of those books as well. So, let's move on with this conversation. The thing about it is that I am listening to Philip talking about these books that he had. I tend to want to know how much of what he read influenced what he did, because there's some sort of dialogue going on between his own spiritual investigations and experiences and the books that he read. And I can say that to some level, it was the same with me. I didn't have Philip's experiences, but the books I read did influence how I perceived the world to some extent based upon my own experiences. He talked about his business of an African mind, page 109, about being an African spirit. I'm an ancient soul in a modern body, a spirit birthed in an African body in the country of Guyana and the universe. I think, Alim, you mentioned that connection again between Guyana and the universe. So it's obvious that Philip had some sense of this connection with the universe from which he derived his own power. I often feel as a timeless being ever existed and deathless. Moore felt that the African body was a home of his spirit. And his frequent mention of this obviously had an influence on the aesthetics of his works. And I noticed, Alim, you did bring up that word atavistic, which is one of the words I like to use very often in referring to Philip Moore, because he was obviously in connection with a spirit force or energy or whatever that came out of Africa. And I digress a bit here because this atavism thing was something I noticed early when I was teaching at St. Francis College. There was a young Chinese student there by the name of Nicholas Kung. I always remember him. Whenever he was asked to do his paintings, especially one involving figures, on his drawing book page, there was these tiny little figures, 1/2 inch, 3/4 inch, scattered all over the page. And I remember meeting his parents, and I asked them if they had any books on Chinese art, and they said no. They were surprised. I said, well, your son is doing classical Chinese paintings. When I was teaching again at Queen's College, there was a little boy there who was of African descent, who was doing similar kinds of drawings like Philip Moore's. He didn't know anything about Philip Moore's work. And so this question of atavism is has a very strong imprint on my mind, is that one can be in tune at an atavistic level, as opposed to when you appropriate something at an intellectual level. So Philip Moore used to like to speak about his books to students and the rest of it. And he often mentioned to them, I overheard him one mentioning to them that they must not read books because they're going to become book artists like Stanley Graves and Donald Locke. You know, and I thought, no, that's a nice thing to say, because one, he is reading books on spiritualism, but the students who are interested in art must not read books on art. But I think what Philip was trying to get there is that they must learn how to communicate internally with themselves, you know, and don't depend too much on those external things like books. Philip, this thing too about the African body, I felt was also an expression of reincarnation. So was Philip's business about the African body really something that he felt deep within him, or was it based on his readings within spiritualism? Because that is one of the issues often discussed in spiritualism. He had a statement there that intrigued me, and which it was this business about art and religion. So he said, art is part of religion, or religion made practical. We all have the wonderful things coming out of the minds of men, music and forms and color, and art in this sense can be viewed as a religion at work. But one of the things that could never get Philip to do was then to give me, I said, Philip, give me a definition then of art and give me a definition of religion, so I'll be better able to understand what you're talking about. Because my understanding of art and my understanding of religion may not necessarily mesh with what you just said. Of course, that got me nowhere. But it also, in my mind, raised the issue of he's linking art and religion, and that religion at work, and art in this sense is religion. And I wondered where, if you believe in God now, where was he putting God in this equation as art's religion? But I think what he was trying to get at is that, again, the internal energies, the internal things working within you gives you the energy to proceed and do something out in the world. I think that's what he was getting at least I hope that's what he said. Another thing that intrigued me was his thing about God manliness. And he would go around spouting man and God and God and man, man and God and God and man. And I was curious about that, because obviously God manliness was a term that he invented for himself. But reading within the religions and the metaphysical processes and concepts of the Far East, that already exists. Man and God and man. You're asked to look inside of you to find God and not outside in the church. And this is what I found curious, is that Philip was saying this, and I wondered how much of this he got on his own, and how much he could have read within the literature. For instance, within the Sufi tradition, this is a very strong foundation concept within the Sufism. The internal look inside you, that's where you will find God. And in other words, wherever you go, God is with you, which has a link with things that Philip was saying. 104. There's a statement that he made, and I did write it down, which was a highly complex statement. And I found it hard to really understand what he was saying. But my reading of Carl Jung and both Freud gave me some insight in perhaps what he was trying to say. And he said, what I do practically know is that man can re-educate his subconscious, and the subconscious mind can come back and make his conscious mind the superconscious. And we can get any amount of knowledge that we want through this personal self-induction. Now, the three states of minds that he spoke about there, of course, those were the three states that Jung spoke about, and also Freud spoke about. But I also know that both of those gentlemen had done quite a lot of reading within the metaphysics of the Far East. And so the subconscious is there, yes. And Jung himself said that he defined the unconscious, which is Philip's, again, subconscious, I treated Philip's subconscious as the unconscious, but again, I don't know how true such a relationship is. You see, because Young described the unconscious is not simply the unknown, it is rather the unknown psychic, which contents the unknown psychic, of which nothing is known directly. Well, Philip would argue against that because he is in direct contact. Whereas here it is, this gentleman is saying that he doesn't know that this thing is not something which can be known directly. But of course, within the metaphysics of the Far East, knowing can be known directly through meditation. And that the knowledge that you gain is also knowledge which cannot be expressed in words. It is something that you feel, which cannot be in words. Something like Philip's sensation about the wind, from which he received all of this energy. The God, yes, this God and man again, that God and man thing goes back even within the Christian tradition of Gnosticism, because they felt that God is within you and not without, which got them into trouble with the organized church. Reincarnation. Now, the Philip Moore's Meditational Museum, it was something he's always talking about. I know when he went to Princeton, his Jewish landlord gave him access to a room, flat, into which he was able to display all of his work with his banner, Moore's Meditational Museum. Apparently, this attracted a lot of attention, apparently from young people. And I learned from a friend of mine who was an American artist who also knew Philip Moore, that it caused some concern within New Jersey. The authorities felt that perhaps Philip was trying to start some cult or something or the other like that. All these young people always going into this place. And so he had to remove his meditation museum. And that is when he had to return back to Guyana. Dennis Williams was very much intrigued with the idea. And so he actually bought the works by Philip Moore, which is now in the National Collection. And he tried to get the government to buy a house which he identified in Queenstown, where Philip could set up his meditation museum and get the whole thing going, which never happened. And I think that was something which sort of would have upsetted Philip quite a bit. This reincarnation bit again, the old atavism, rather, the atavism thing. I remember seeing the work of Betsy Karim, and I felt very much that Betsy Karim was also operating at an atavistic level. And when I looked at the very early works of Alim Hosein, his earliest carvings, there is also that very strong sense of atavism going on. And even when you spoke to him, I remember we were discussing things with him, he also spoke in that kind of metaphysical, spiritual manner that Philip did. And so I used to refer to him as our indigenous Philip Moore, indigenous Philip Moore. So there's this thing, and I'm very interested in it, is this thing of the direct racial memory and not just appropriation of a culture and the artifacts of a culture, because that is something I've seen a lot going on as well. Somebody would assume that because they have an African or East Indian background, then they can appropriate these symbols and do things with it. Nothing wrong with that. But that there's a difference between appropriation and a direct, being in direct contact with, as in the case of Philip, which is the whole atavistical problem. I think that's about what I have to say about it.
Did you want to speak very briefly about any of those
yes,
sculptures?
Yes, of course, I forgot about the painting, which is called Cooperation.
Okay. I'm going to try and share that now. You may disappear, but we'll still hear your voice.
Yes. That painting that he called Corporate, I looked at that painting and I was sort of amused at one stage. And then looking at it, I began to realize that this thing actually was a little encyclopedia. Philip Moore is talking about here in this painting about cooperation, which is in reference, of course, to the time when we had the Socialist Cooperative Republic, asking people to cooperate. So the man is cooperating with the woman and they're pounding fufu. But in Africa, we know that pounding fufu is something which is done only by women. But in this case, put in a Guyana context, the man is assisting the woman to pound the fufu. I'm looking at it and I realize as well that the pounding of the fufu, you have the mortar and you have the pestle. And that reminded me very much of the lingam yoni that is found within the tantric temples in India. So I do not know if that, I am making that association, but I do not know whether that was something that was an intention of Philip Moore's. Looking at it again, even closely, I realized that next to the man, there is an outline in dots, which is an outline of a woman. And next to the woman, there's an outline in dots, which is the outline of the man. And I'm saying this is very interesting indeed, because it takes me to the Chinese symbol of the yin and yang, where the male has a female element within him, and the female has a male element within her. And I also linked the yang and yin symbol again with the lingam yoni tantric metaphysics, the unity of opposites. Because duality is something I personally feel duality is the foundation of the universe. Whatever you can think of, the opposite immediately exists. You don't even have to think about it. The opposite immediately exists. And this is one of the reasons, and no offense meant to those of religious persuasion, that as long as you can think of God, the devil exists as well. The two of them coexist. And you have to bring both of them together in order to create a certain kind of unity. And it is this search for unity that is behind both the Chinese yin-yang symbol and also the lingam yoni, which is in the tantric tradition. So I thought this painting actually was for me like a little encyclopedia about the existence of duality, man and woman, and also the way in which they can come together in order to create a certain kind of unity. And in this case, the unity is expressed by the pounding of the fufu. So that the other one that interested me was the water mama, the sculpture. We all know about the water mama thing in Guyana, which is, of course, a tradition coming out of Central Africa, especially amongst the people of the Congo, like the Bakongo people. And here, Philip is showing a female figure, the water mother. You're seeing the ripples on the skin, which could be translated in two ways, because on one side, they're painted red, and they are more triangular, like the serrated edges. And on the other sides, they're more rectangular. More in ripples. So it is the water force, the force of water, and also perhaps the scales of a fish. But what particularly fascinated me was the objects on the stomach of the person, because that area is actually the area of one of the chakras within the Hindu tradition. And usually within the Egyptian tradition, the stomach is really the seat of the soul, not the heart as we tend to feel. It is a stomach. And we all know that when we get emotionally involved at a certain level, the stomach is where we feel it first. And in some cases, you know, you can become so highly involved or whatever, that it will even cause you to vomit, the reaction from the stomach. So here now, the stomach, one of the centers, the chakra centers, and Philip has fruits, bananas and fruits surrounding in a sort of circle, and in the middle of it, there is a flower. Now, within the water mama tradition, amongst the Yoruba and in Central Africa, Yemanje in Brazil, in Cuba as well, very strong traditions there. Offerings are made to Yemanja, going to the sea and making offerings of fruit or whatever you want to. If you were a fisherman, you would make little model boats and put your offerings and ship them out into the sea. And the flower, Philip, there it's painted, but that flower actually for Yemanja is actually a white flower. And so those who are taking part in the ceremony, they usually dress in white. and they would carry white flowers, which they would offer into the sea. But the first time I noticed it, I thought, because it was painted, I thought that this was perhaps in reference to the Sufi tradition of the rose, where the rose symbolizes, because it has that very strong perfume, the rose is a symbol amongst the Sufis of the soul. And it is from that rose, from the Sufis, that the Western people who came into contact with them created that society that they call the Rosicrucians. But the Rosicrucians are very firmly based on some of the metaphysical concepts of the Sufis. So at first I thought it was a reference to that. But then I remember that the people who celebrate the Umangi festival, both in Cuba and in Brazil, it's this festival where they make use of the white flower. So I thought that that Philip, he got it right in having the flower and also the fruits, which are offerings. That is as much as I can say about Uncle Philip. And to use a Guyanese expression, I would say, I done, I gone. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stan. Thank you. We're going to move on now to Dennis de Caires, a Guyanese-born artist who studied in London at the Royal College of Art and in Paris at Cité Internationale, and has worked since as an artist and educator. Over to you, Dennis.
Let me share my screen. Good afternoon, good evening, everybody. Thank you, Philip and Alim. When we discussed this presentation, I wanted to do something that was a little bit different because I knew that Alim and Stanley would cover ground and I didn't want to go over that. So I'm taking a slightly different approach to Philip. I met him several times and I interviewed him on film. Unfortunately, I don't have access to it here. But I met him a few times and I wanted to talk about a few specific pieces of work, 2 paintings and the 1763 monument. I have got a lot of slides to show you and I'm not going to ask you to read very much. I just want to run through this to begin with so that it makes sense of what follows. So I want to highlight that his achievement is across both 2 dimensions and 3 dimensions, and I think Philip would have called them artifacts. I don't think he made the distinction between painting and sculpture, 2 and 3 dimensions, but I think it's notable that he is consistent in using in both areas. I want to try and establish, we've already looked at the obvious key importance of his religious and spiritual, mystical, psychic approach to making art, how the art fitted into that. And I want to try and establish the importance of his work and it's slightly different in the physical location of Guyana and Guyana within South America. And then I also want to see his work. I don't want to disagree with any family members. I'm not sure that he was entirely original. I would argue that he fits in to a bigger body of work, other artists within Guyana and writers in Guyana. I want to look at the 1763 monument in terms, it's very, very prescient to talk about it now, I think, in terms of what's happening globally. And then I think I'd like to argue that his work is important beyond Guyana because the world itself, we've heard from Alim and Stanley, how sophisticated and wide his thinking was on the relationship between man, woman, and nature. And so this is the next, I just want to read, so I'll leave you to read the call, Hazelwood and the Rupert Rhine. I was chastised earlier for doing this too quickly, but both of those contextualize his work within Guyana. And I think as Alim has explored, And Stanley's touched on the religions in Guyana, I think, come together in Philip's work, and he creates something new. So I don't think he just appropriates. I personally feel that Philip has come up with something new. So 3 works I want to look at, 2 paintings I know quite well, Birds of a Feather and Shopping Centre in Georgetown, both in the 90s. So I saw them being painted when he was working under the Borough School of Art. And I want to highlight those because I think they show the breadth of his approach to subject matter and the difference in the subject matter. So one is pastoral, is rural, and one is the city, is urban. And some of you may know that Philip lived on a farm in the Guyanese and worked his farm for many, many years. And he also went into Georgetown. I think you may recognize this map from Mr. and Mrs. Google, who I think live in the States, because they've got that journey is 2 hours and 18 minutes. And I'm reliably told before the bridge, it would take 7 or 8 hours for that journey to be completed. And I've been musing about this a lot because I think that journey from Philip's farm, and there are a lot of artists at the moment interested in agriculture, and Philip was genuinely running a farm for a very, very long time, for 50 odd years, I believe. So for him, fruit meant something else. It meant stuff that he grew, and I often thought about what he thought about on that journey from, and it's not 2 hours, 18 minutes, it's been a lot longer, and he did it regularly. I only ever met him in Georgetown, not at the Guyanese. And I've often thought about that between this journey, and maybe he read, maybe he looked at the landscape, but I'm pretty sure he thought a lot about what he was doing. This Birds of a Feather is a painting that is not schematic, but it's highly organized. To understand Philip's work, you have to step outside of a Western European tradition of easel painting of landscape. He doesn't present you with an image, the picturesque. You have to experience, and I'm saying this to you, we're looking at 8 pixels on a screen, but you really need to experience Philip's work in the flesh. The painting has 20 birds on it. 5 at the top are going from left to right, and then the next birds down are going from right to left, and the 2 layers below are diving into the water to catch these fish. So he's connecting the animal world, sky and water. There are 25 suns in there, and I would argue that to understand Philip's connection to his physical location meant that his subject matter included temperature, humidity in Guyana, where if you're in Georgetown, and the humidity gets up to in the 90s, you feel it immediately. It's a very physical thing. The light and the difference between the light in Georgetown and Guyanese, I think he incorporates wind into this image, and I think he incorporates sound. So there are 25 suns. I think there's rain in the painting. And what I wanted to look at, I quickly wanted to run through. So this is it's about, both paintings are roughly 4 feet by 6 feet, 2 meters by 1.5 meters, roughly. And I wanted to look at how he actually does this. So the way Philip applied paint was normally in short brush strokes or pushing the tube of paint itself onto the canvas and bring it to it, or straws. So you don't get very long brush strokes in Philip's paintings. You get these short. You can see in this one, he's put some mesh against the painting and brush or rag through it. And again, on this one, you can see that the birds are built up. There's no one continuous brush stroke that goes all the way around. It's made up of a series of brush strokes. And then behind that, there is another layer of brush strokes. And this is the surface of the water. So again, short, sharp brush strokes. And what that amounts to is an image that you have to experience at the bottom of this bird and its feathers on the wings. You have to experience it because the effect of looking at that works on the retina. It's a physical retinal, just as the location, the physical location is affecting him, that wind, that heat. I say affecting him, but he's aware of it. It's a very similar way that you don't get the pictorial, the picturesque. You have to experience the painting in the flesh. To contrast that, I want to talk about this painting, Shopping Centre, Georgetown, which is quite different. It is structured, the movement in this painting, the composition, the movement goes from left to right, top to bottom. There are people coming out the shop, there are people going in the shop. It has noise. If you know Georgetown, it's a noisy place to go to. And I think it contrasts with that rural, I wouldn't say pastoral scene, but it contrasts in a useful way, I think, in terms of coming together with city and countryside. The painting, the other things I said, it's not the picturesque, it doesn't present the view. Every square inch of that painting has something in it. So you have to scan it and you have to experience it. You have to spend time with it to get into the painting. It doesn't offer you perspectives to enter into it. And I want to, so looking at it, it occurred to me afterwards, I looked at this painting a lot. Up in the top, you can see the electricity. And so I wanted to, I'm going to go to the next slide, and forgive me this, I'm not being deliberately provocative, but I want to show this slide, which is a Picasso print that I know from the British Museum, and I studied it for years, and I love this image. And it took me a long, long time to understand that one of the things that excited Picasso was the arrival of electricity in houses in the 50s all across France. Electricity would have been installed. And it's a really simple thing, but it's a powerful event. And so we tend to think of Philip's work as being mystical. Here is this electricity going along the poles. But in fact, that extraordinary thing that's electricity also affected artists in Western Europe. So this is a detail of the shopping center. And you can see on there, I think Stanley mentioned Philip's love of reading. And I don't like the term folk art to describe Philip's work because I think it's highly sophisticated and complex. And the use of words in this painting, I won't, if I go back just to, you'll see in that, there's wholesale, retail, shopping center, buy. And I think I'd like to suggest that those elements within the painting, these details that we see, you can see the blue there is the tube of paint pushed onto it and pulled off. And then above it, in the, just below cheap and something else, it says that you'll see some sequins that are pushed in to glue on the canvas. And that means that when you turn on an electric bulb, for example, that changes and it reflects the light. And I would argue that these little brushstrokes and elements within the painting almost serve as words in creating a bigger text. So the electricity up in the sky, I think is there, and electricity in Georgetown. Alim was saying that he had a power cut earlier on today and the panic that brought on, but you know, anyone in Georgetown, electricity is a problem and has been for a very long time, particularly when these paintings were made. So these are the two paintings. I wanted to compare those two for subject matter and for their difference in formal approaches and material approaches. But as I said, I think it's important to see Philip's work within a broader context of Guyanese writers and painters. And I've only got 20 minutes, so I've been very selective. And this is just to give you an idea. I think the location of Guyana is very important for artists in the country and And by artist, I mean everyone that is involved creatively. That's something. I think somebody has audio on. Either that or. Anyway, this is Aubrey Williams, and I wanted to show two, I picked two specifically of Aubrey's that reflect this influence of South America that Aubrey was seeing himself within the continent. Aubrey worked as an agricultural field officer in New Guyana, and I wanted to put a couple of Frank Bowling's paintings in, which reference South America, and which curiously was something that wasn't really explored at the big retrospective he had in London at the time. So you have those artists, you have the writers, you have Palace of the Peacock, you have Wilson Harris and Middle Holt and others, but I'm trying to keep this manageable. So to see Philip's work within a broader context of other art that's being made in Guyana in this new little crazy country, trying to find its, finding its independence and trying to find its own way. And within that context, within that context of South America, that journey I showed earlier from the quarantine to Georgetown, there's two red dots. And if you go just a little bit up to Venezuela and to north of Caracas, and again, I'm going to be very quick on this, there's an artist called Armando Riberon, Venezuelan. And I think it's very useful to look at his work, not to compare it to Philip's, but to understand what Philip was doing in terms of a personalized and individual approach to making art was replicated just north in Venezuela. And I think there are interesting similarities between Armando Riberon, who also built his own little studio and dwelling, which he filled with these strange objects that he made. When I first saw the paintings in Caracas, they reminded me of Philip's work, mainly because of the way they were put on. But the more I explored, Armando Riberon had his own philosophy about making art. He made his brushes. And I think Philip Chiguez recognizes this. This is from a show that was held at MoMA in New York in 2007, where they incorporated some of these works taken out of his, which is now the Armando Riberon Museum, and put into a gallery space. So like Stanley mentioned about Moore's Museum of Meditation. And I put this little, this leaflet is from the National Art Gallery in Venezuela, just in case by any chance we had any politicians from Guyana listening, that they might see that these crazy artists can actually be very useful in the 21st century for cultural tourism. Anyway, I just wanted to plug that for Philip. So back to South America, and in 1976, there is, led by Vernon, there is a call to produce some monument as a monument to the 1763 Burmese Revolution with coffee. And Philip Moore won that commission. It involved a number of people. Viola Burnham, I think, lobbied Philip, what I understand. She was well acquainted with Philip. Thank God she did. She was well acquainted with Philip and suggested his work. And so here is this country 10 years into independence, looking to find some monument that celebrates independence. I think that's the key thing. And whilst preparing this talk last week, by pure chance, I read that in the museum, the National Archives in the Netherlands, they are right now having an online exhibition, Rebellion and Freedom, in which Caffey's letter to the governor, the Dutch governor of Greaves, is being shown. And I put this in because it's important that the Dutch are looking at this in terms of what they see about the 1763, how it affected them. And I think that it's an extraordinary thing in looking at that revolution from a Guyanese point of view. So 10 years later, they come up with this, and this is Rupert Ryan again talking about the monument. I have to say that I am in complete agreement with this. I think it's one of the most, I thought it was one of the most powerful monuments in the Caribbean. And I'm now of the view that it's one of the most important globally, internationally. I'm going to go into a smaller minority, the minority of the minority, because I'd like to argue that the base of the sculpture was very carefully worked out. It wasn't just an individual private commission. The government wanted something that was a civic sculpture. And I think that's critical, because this is the base that is hit. And I would like to argue that the base is a critical aspect of its success. And I'll talk about that a bit more once I show you. Oh, sorry. Yeah, so a lot of thought went into this. If you know where it is in Georgetown, it's located at the end of the east end of Brick Dam. And at one end, so it's a key access within Georgetown. And at the west end, you have the Houses of Parliament. And then further up, you go to the Independence Arch, which was a gift from Al Khan in 1966. And then you go up to the monument, the 1763 monument. And to the left of that is Castellani House, which was Burnham's residence, but it's now the National Gallery. And then behind the monument is Jubilee Park, where national parades and carnival and mash and so on are held. Now, what I wanted to compare, the reason why I think it's such an important work is that Dennis Williams was involved, key player in the commissioning of this sculpture, and they wanted something that wasn't a Victorian bronze stuck on a plinth. And I think that's really important. They wanted something that was participatory. So Dennis Williams invited Albert Rodriguez to do the base for that, because and I think the base is critical. I'm going to come back to it at the end, because I just want to show you something that's quite extraordinary in terms of Philip's monument in relation to works around the Caribbean that also memorialize revolutionaries or, on the whole, slavery. And I must add, I haven't seen all of them, but I've seen a lot of them. And the one thing you'll notice, they're all bronze, elevated, and they're nearly all naturalistic. These two are from Cuba. This is one of the only ones that involves a woman, because she was one of the three slaves who led the rebellion. This is Redemption Song in Kingston in a park. This is Desdem Cadena in Curacao. I haven't seen this. Nor this, which is in Dominica. This is the Bussa monument that is in Barbados, and regrettably sits in the middle of a roundabout on a busy highway, so you can't approach it. But again, it's a naturalistic bronze rendering. This is from Haiti. I haven't seen this in the flesh. So we have these around the Caribbean, and that's how I've always seen Philip's 1763 monument in relation to other monuments in the Caribbean. A couple of years back, Clara Walker, the American artist, won the commission at the Tate, and she re-examined the fountain that was outside Buckingham Palace in a completely different way. And I think it is an extraordinary work. So Philip has been invited to do this commission. Not far from the law courts. This is a Queen Victorian, it's marble, it was carved in England and shipped out to Guyana. This is the only image I could find of it, and as you can see, she's missing her left hand and some of her nose because Queen Victoria was removed in 1970 and taken up to the Botanical Gardens. And in terms of what's happening with sculptures and statues around the world, I think it's important. I took some students from Barbados Community College to Guyana on a study trip a few years back. And I was horrified to discover that Queen Elizabeth was back on her plinth in that form. They'd raised money to put her back on her plinth when the 1763 monument needed so much attention to get the fountain working again. Anyway, I was completely shocked. I don't know where the funds came from, but she is back on her throne. But it, I understand, has been vandalized a couple of times. So back to Philip's work. I think it's related to what Alim and Stanley, particularly what Alim was saying. I think this represents all the religions and races of Guyana. And Stanley mentioned Ozzy Hussein. And when we talk about this psychic space that Philip talked about, the psychic energy, I remember talking to Ozzy Hussein and asking him about Brazil. And that didn't make any sense to him. The land was the land, and how we divided it up into countries didn't make much sense. And I think that sense of time and space is incorporated into this. And when we looked earlier at the paintings, so the stand, I'd argue, it should have water coming out of it. The water represented the significance of water to all the religions in Guyana. It also would have fallen in sheets of water, a reference to Caires, which is a key visual image in Guyana. And when we look at this, so if you look at the detail of the paintings where they were built up of small brush strokes, on the more coffee figure, the surface itself is broken up. So this is not a naturalistic illustration of a slave. I would argue this represents something beyond that. I think it's also key that we tend to forget the political context from which this came. Remember when this was commissioned in 1976, it was the Socialist Republic of Guyana, Cooperative Republic of Guyana. And the Soviet influence in Guyana was strong. And I think the base of this references some of those concrete sculptures and bases of memorials in Eastern European communism. And I think that's important. I think it's significant. So again, this is the broken surface of this. The form of it, just as with the paintings, you need to spend time looking at them. The form of this forces you in 3 dimensions to move around it, to understand it. And to grasp it, to understand it, you must keep moving, so you have to be engaged. It's participatory. It's not a sculpture that allows you to be passive. As I said, I think it's one of the greatest monuments I know. And I wanted to put my final image, I just wanted to put this into, because I know there are complaints about it's too high up, or it represents this, or if you're coming down the Ascension Road heading south, from the height of a car seat, it looks as though Coffee has his penis in his hand, and there's lots of derogatory feelings about this sculpture, but I think it's a stunning work. I think it's a key work, and I don't think it's too fanciful or unhelpful to show this image, which is the Michelangelo David, which originally was in one of the squares, and like the 1763 monument, had a civic purpose in terms of creating the identity of Florence. So just like that electricity with Pablo Picasso earlier, what Philip Moore is doing in Georgetown is not something, not so some lunacy that's going on. He is being called upon to do things that have happened in other highly developed cultural states. And the David was part of its intent, part of its function, was to help establish the state of Florence. And it's now in a museum, so it's changed, so meaning's changed. But I think it's useful to hang on to what that context was of how the 1763 monument came about. I was going to give a conclusion, but I think I've spoken for too long. So I want to finish just thanking the people who helped with the getting the detailed images, and I enjoyed discussing with Alim some of the stuff about Philip. That's it. I hope that was helpful.
That's great. Thanks, Dennis. Would you like to stop sharing your screen, or would you like me to do it for you?
I would like to, I can't find the button on here.
That's fine, no problem.
Stop sharing.
Yeah. Okay, thank you very much for that. Would the panel like to comment or question each other on anything before we open up the to the floor?
Yeah.
I see Stanley raising a hand.
Yeah, there was one thing I forgot to mention that Philip said, quote, "I think that there is no other artist that does work like I do. They have not been converted to the inner chambers of their spirituality." And that is not true, really. What is true is Philip's link with his atavistic African thing, because you have in Britain you had Samuel Palmer, you had William Blake, and in Jamaica you had also Everard Brown, Capo, and John Dunkley. So there are people who have been using their own inner religious, in a manner of speaking, feelings and experiences in order to produce work at a certain level, if one wants to refer to this at a cosmic level. The thing about the coffee monument, I did not like the Albert's pedestal one bit. To me, it looked like a cake, some sort of cake or something like that, or coffee is floating on water lilies. I thought of it with a piece of work with that strength, that a truncated pyramid would have made the entire thing, give it a certain visual unity, and all of the other plaques that Philip has around the bottom, those could have been placed around the four sides of that truncated pyramid. Oh, the coffee thing in the monument in Barbados, which is Bossa. Mm-hmm. That Bossa was really supposed to be in Guyana, because it was Martin Carter, when he was a Minister of Culture, who commissioned Carl Broodhagen in Barbados to make a coffee monument. When it never came to pass. And when I spoke to Broodhagen, he said he didn't know what happened because he never heard from them back again. And also when that monument was taken over by the Barbadian government, Broodhagen was asked, could he please put some clothes onto Bossa? So he had to dress up Bossa. But the thing that I found most alarming was that on the plinth of the Bossa, nowhere is Broodhagen's name mentioned. I thought that was a disaster. If I was Broodhagen, I would have blew up the whole thing, you know. And that's as much as I have to say. Thank you.
Just to join in there about the location and the coffee. Philip told me that there was a part of the monument as he had designed it that had a wheel, which represented the symbol of the United Force Party, the rising sun. The spokes of the wheel represented the palm tree, which was a symbol of the PNC. And then on one of the spokes, there was a cup, the symbol of the PPP. And that was supposed to be at the base of the monument. And now, when you visit the monument, you put your finger in the cup and you spin the wheel like a Tibetan prayer wheel. You spin it, so that there's a Tibetan influence there too. And you commit yourself to remove prejudice, etc., from your mind. So that that was his plan for the base of the monument. And somehow that, I don't know if it never got made or if it was made but not used or what. And he continued to be upset about that for quite a long time. But the monument was supposed to be interactive, lower to the ground, interactive, and it was supposed to speak to all of the peoples and parties and politics, etc., of Guyana.
But
Like I said,
Philip
Yeah,
speaks of the shopping center. That painting is so highly constructed, and it reminded me of a term that they use in the horror vacui, a dislike for empty spaces. So Philip,
which we can say about your work too, Stanley.
Every single square inch, you know, is covered with something or the other. Yes, and Bessie Karim does the same thing as well.
Yeah, yeah. And we can say the same about some of your work too. Yeah, go ahead, Dennis.
No, I was just going to say, just as the minority of one, if you compare that Queen Victoria outside the law courts with what Philip has created at the end of Brick Dam, I think it's a stunning achievement for someone in Guyana to come up with that. It's such a complicated, it's a civic work, so it goes beyond Philip. And I know a bit about the cup and so on at the bottom, but I think that's a very literal, I think it's actually better. So I will close, I realize as a minority of one, I'm trying to persuade myself, but I do think that the energy within the base takes it away from being just another plinth like the Bussa or the Queen Victoria. And by the way, when I showed those images from around the region, I was not trying to be disrespectful or critical in any way. I just wanted to show the huge difference between the Kafi monument and the others in the region. I won't try to persuade anyone else on that.
Okay.
I was glad also for the literary references to Mittelholzer, Wilson Harris, etc. I was thinking also about Mittelholzer when I was doing my research, because the same sense of energy and difference and something that was being pushed back, that needed to be released. And that is what Mittelholzer did in many of his works, in speaking about this energy that is in the Guyanese landscape, that could find its way into furniture and different kinds of things, and connecting it back to the drumbeat and even the Dutch spirit in My Bones and My Flute. And so there's a whole great tradition of this different kind of energy that is not captured by Christianity, that is alive in the Guyanese thinking. And even in Seymour's poem, There Runs a Dream, where you have the bush actually creeping back foot by quiet foot, like a being itself, you know, and coffee there. We had the talk, Blood on the River, the other day at Morey House, with Coffee and what he tried to do in his rebellion/revolution. And there was also the English poet, William Blake, who is also like Coffee in creating the same kind of concept of God manliness, that God is within the human being. And so there are many other kinds of references that we could attach Philip Moore to. It's a very rich center that you can spread out in many directions from.
I agree. In fact, there's one thing, if I just, when you were talking there about the similarities with Mittelholzer, one thing that sprung to mind was this great story of Mittelholzer hawking his early stories door to door. And there is a reference to Philip going around with his works of art on a dray cart to, you know, from, I don't know if it was village to village or household to household. And there is in his work this sort of inbuilt portability this idea that it should be, you know, it should be movable. It should be able to go from place to place.
Michelangelo was also somebody who's deeply interested in spiritualism. You know, if I'm sure all his work. But Dennis Williams once says that that the Guyanese people are very spiritual people. Dennis Williams said that to me once. Yes.
So there we go. Maybe. I think we might just open up to questions from the floor now. Do either raise your hand, or you can, depending on how many we have, unmute. Okay, I see the first one I see is from Brendan. Would you like to go ahead?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, thank you very much for that. I wanted to ask a question. There were a couple of books that were published in the last decade about Caribbean modernism, specifically looking at the anthologies that were put together in Europe of West Indian writing, and how they failed to place the writers correctly, because they either wanted to shoehorn them into an English cultural space, or to interpret them as a sort of species of African writing, or they didn't know how to handle them at all. And when they did have writers that had assimilated intellectually to the European traditions, people like Wilson Harris, Mittelholzer, they also couldn't quite get them right. So they couldn't see the links between modernism and a man like Harris, Wilson Harris, or Mittelholzer. And a lot of what you were just describing, and if you look at Rupert's extended analysis of something like Baton, you realize that the amount of cultural knowledge you need to pull the meanings out of some of these images is well beyond not simply the viewer, but many of the critics. And I wondered to what extent has Philip Moore suffered from the lack of that comprehension of what he was doing. Stanley, I suppose I'd begin with you.
The whole question of the position of the visual arts in Guyana and the creative arts on the whole depends on what is not happening in education. So to understand Philip, to understand modernism, all these various things, it means that people have to be educated into the language, to try to be able to make references and to make connections and so on. But apart from that, you also have to look at the work which is produced in the Caribbean, is referencing to things within the Caribbean. And when we try to put work in the Caribbean out into the international scene, we run into problems because people don't know what the hell we're talking about. You know, I had that problem at university because my paintings would have meant absolutely nothing. Unfortunately, because of the work I was doing in making little models and sculpture, I was actually asked by the sculpture tutor if I would consider doing sculpture, and that saved my soul and my life. Just a whole bunch of context. Again, Aubrey Williams, I spent a year hanging around with Aubrey Williams. Aubrey Williams also suffered. Aubrey was as good a colorist as any in Britain at the time, but he was never put into that category. And I think also because he was trying to ensure, this is my interpretation, that the people of the region, the Caribbean and South America, had a place within the culture. The fact that he did not use a lot of Amerindian indigenous people's symbols to the extent that he used the Mayas, I felt was because as far as the people in Britain were concerned, they would, in a manner of speaking, know more about the Mayas than they was known about the Arawaks and the Makusis and people in Guyana. So this thing of having a cultural location is extremely critical. And it can either make or destroy a person in the way you decide that you are going to be working and what kind of work you're going to be producing. Because the work has to be referenced to the culture that you belong. If you move into another culture, you will have to begin assimilating into that culture, which is what Frank Bowling did. And Frank Bowling has said it, that as far as he's concerned, he was British because he's been influenced by British culture, you know? So you have to depend on which road you're going to take. You're going to take the right, the left, or you're going to go straight ahead.
Thank you. Dennis or Alan, would you like to add anything to that?
Yes, I would. And I think that's part of why I wanted to contextualize the 1763 monument within current discussions internationally about what's happening, because the slave trading countries determined everything. The exhibition that's happening in the Netherlands now, they own the letter from Coffee. They have written the story. We didn't have that in Guyana. And I think that doesn't mean we can produce anything, as Philip testifies to the fact that Guyanese can come up with the most extraordinary artifacts and works of art. But when I was looking through some stuff recently, I came across a symposium on Aubrey Williams's work at Cambridge University in England. And there were about 10 speakers and no one was Guyanese. And I thought, these are people coming down and in a funny kind of reverse, taking on what was the standard bearer. They're now reversing and they're coming down and taking Aubrey Williams and elevating him to something without understanding the context that he came out of. And look at Aubrey's work without recognizing the significance of the physical reality of South America. And you have to have a different sense of space and sound and rhythm and so on. And I don't think they can appreciate that. So I got just one, the Armando Reveron was selected by John Elderfield and a couple of other curators at MoMA in New York. And I wrote this sentence down earlier. This is on their on the introduction to the exhibition of Armando Reveron. So this, you know, chap working in his crazy little shelter. And the Americans say these highly tactile paintings are unique in early modernism and seem to anticipate later monochromatic abstract art. Are we allowed to swear on Moray House Trust? That's absolute bullshit. Because these paintings in early modernism, that's the whole point of it, that you cannot take your European canon and apply it. You have to understand that and that's why I mentioned Armando Reveron, what he and Philip were doing. You have to make an effort to get out of your space and go into the new space. And that's why Philip is so exciting in the 21st century. Right. I'm not leaving the discussion, but I got to check the bathroom just to make sure.
Okay. Okay, I can see a question from Jocelyn, who actually knew Philip very well, I believe. Jocelyn.
Hi. Should I put on a video? Yeah.
No, it's fine, whichever you're happy with. Got a good view of your desk or floor at the moment.
I know. Not so much of a zoomer.
That's
anyhow.
Fine. Don't worry.
We're drinking now, Jocelyn.
As a dog, one of the things that I'm glad that Alim mentioned the thing about, I started coffee. Philip was particularly interested when he first did coffee, that it be at ground level. He told me that he wanted children to be able to crawl all over coffee, to become acquainted with the scars and the pain. And the notion of the wheel was that power was not static, that it could change. And he used the three parties at the time, the symbols of the three parties, the cup, the palm tree, and the sun. And the idea was that that wheel was going to be, if not fix the coffee, would it be around the surrounding, whatever it was, splits. He had never intended it to be high. But when he did it, and for whatever reason, as Alim said, it was raised. And I do agree with Dennis. I think all the better because it elevated it in every sense into something that Guyanese had to contemplate and reckon with what it meant. In his hands, the coffee's hands, there's a pig and the dog that he's squeezing. And for Philip, those represented the throttling of greed and ignorance. That was very important to him, what coffee was holding in his hands. The notion that you were going to have to squash, in a way, greed and ignorance. So that's one thing. When, in fact, it was raised high and the water, the fountains came about, it really pleased them a lot, because it was not only was there water, it was colored. At one time they had spotlights on it. So like, especially when there were things that were ceremonial. The thing about coffee then is that it became so alienating for some, was that it was seen as a kind of power base of the PNC and of Burnham. And there was therefore that relationship to it, that it was not for all. And this was partly why I think Philip wanted the wheel, to say, in fact, there was place for everyone in this. And that, in a sense, pained him. But to link that to Alim, to the meditation museum, he really wanted this meditation museum. And he finally, before he died, had hoped that it could be built behind coffee. That there would be a place where people could go and the paintings would all be there, or the sculptures, and they could sit on benches behind the coffee and contemplate our past, our present, our future, and so on. Now, the Meditation Museum just never, I found any comfort with any of the authorities as far as I could see then or now. But it would be a very important part, I think, of the recognition of Philip, to have a meditation museum, or at least a meditation space within a museum for what there is. That's one. Second thing is, I would like to say about Philip, he always wanted his art to be available at a very popular level. So he was very interested and spent a lot of time experimenting on things like table maps. There was a period in time when he took some of his paintings and he had them reproduced and laminated for there to be, they were fabulous. Table mats. He wanted people to be able to have any number of objects that they would have in their home, which were would replicate this, not just posters, but things that were utilitarian. He wanted people to use them. And at one point, I did have some table mats a long time ago, but with the fires, all of that is gone. So that's not a thing. Then he was also keen about speaking to the moment. So when the barrel culture became so pronounced in Guyana, he would bring these barrels of elaborate artwork on them. And remember, we're having discussions, Mervyn Awan will be there to say, Philip, we didn't think that the quality of the cardboard and the barrels would be able to last the work that you have put into them. So the barrels would be the cardboard barrels with the top, and they would be painted all over with all sorts of scenes of people going to collect barrels, doing this and that. I don't know what happened to a lot of the barrels. People weren't I used to try to sell his things in my showroom from time to time. And he had, in fact, a studio for quite a while below where I was in Charlotte Street, because he didn't have a studio at that time. Then he did a number of things with car parts. So he had big chandeliers done with hubcaps, huge monumental pieces, hubcaps. He also had a lot done with calabashes. Huge calabash pieces. A lot of them were at, there was Chris at the time, where he stayed. So he worked by me and he stayed over to Chris for a long time. Gregory Christiani was exceptionally kind to Philip in that period when he was, in a sense, he had nowhere to live in Georgetown. So he would go back to quarantine, but he would spend months in the hotel where he was doing his art. He had more than one room upstairs doing his work. And the calabash pieces would be in the foyer or the lobby of the hotel when you came in, which was a real kind of popular spot. But Philip's calabash pieces were there. He also had a big thing about bottle corks. He had chandeliers of bottle corks. And one of his big pieces, which he always resented Banks DIH, is he had entered a competition about Degas, and he did this painting, which was called The Bottle Cork King, or The Man with the Midas Touch, was actually what it was called. But people used to say, and the entire painting was composed of images collected, like how he did the heads and trims, but the entire thing was bottle corks. He would paint all these, it was 8x4, the painting, The Man with the Midas Touch, and it's stored over by Marvin, and it is to come back home. He also...
Jocelyn, I'm going to have to just ask you to wrap because we have a couple other questions.
Okay. But I just want to say that Philip wanted his art not to be just in museums or things. He really wanted it accessible to ordinary people at reasonable cost through this thing. That was one thing.
Thank you.
And
thanks
very much for this, Isabel.
Oh, great pleasure. We have Mr. Agard, who's been extremely patient. Would you like to ask your question now, Mr. Agard?
Yes, I'm trying to unmute. Yes. Okay. Thank you very much. There's just one on some hidden question about the 1763 monument that Dennis Williams actually told me about, in person. The monument, after it was completed at the foundry in England, and photographs were sent back to the then Minister of Culture, the late Shirley Field Ridley, and she presented the photographs of the monument to the Parliament, members of Parliament, the leaders of government, and they actually humiliated her, and they were in total disagreement of this monstrosity that she had caused the government and people of Guyana to spend money on. So Shirley Field really went back to Dennis and said to Dennis, is what trouble you put me in here, So he's telling me this story actually, and he said to me, he sang at his desk right there and then, and he wrote and presented what he had written to Shirley, and Shirley took that back to Parliament and sort of laced them with the wisdom that Dennis had to reveal, their ignorance, which speaks to one major problem with art and culture, our lack of cultural leadership. Had it not been for Dennis Williams, the coffee monument would not have been standing there as we see it today. And Shirley Field Ridley, of course, because she understood what Dennis was trying to do for us, But the leaders at the highest level of our government did not even understand its significance. So I just wanted to share that,
Thank you. Thank you very much.
We still have a far way to go. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Any of the panel like to comment on that? No. Okay, I thought I saw one other hand. And I don't think we've had any questions on the other platforms this evening. If there are no more questions, it has been quite a long session. So I think we're probably going to start wrapping. I just have a sort of closing remark, and I'm glad it's come up a few times, and I will ask each of the panel to sort of have a final few words after this. I'm quoting again from Rupert's essay about Philip. A lasting disappointment for Moore, in addition to his grievances over the fate of the monument, is that the work he has devoted a lifetime to producing is not serving the purpose it was created to serve. And then he goes on to say, his dream is of a meditation center where the works will be placed in room after room, creating a total environment for the explorations of the spirit. And what a radiant place that would be. A people who professed real respect for the river of works which has flowed from the mind of Moore for the last half a century would go to great lengths to ensure that Moore's methodical meditation museum came into being while he is still among us. It is now 9 years, this is me, since Philip Moore died. There are nearly 150 odd pieces of his work in the National Collection. Perhaps it is time to house these in a space so that they are constantly on view, constantly accessible to all who walk in the footsteps of this particular son of the quarantine. And it was very interesting to hear what not just the panel, but also Jocelyn, who knew Philip very well, had to say about this. I was quite interested to hear that she said that he actually hoped it would be right behind the 1763 monument. So panel, do you have any final closing thoughts before we...
Yes, Philip said about himself, a life of work, an eternity of experience. I think a beautiful summation of Philip, of himself, a life of work and the experience. Yes, thank you.
Lovely. Dennis?
Well, I was going to, a few points I want to conclude with, simple, powerful things, hopefully to come out of today's discussion. We need a Guyanese-led initiative to restore the 1763 monument, to repair it and get the water flowing. That should, I think, as a matter of urgency. I think we need a safe and open access archive to share his work online, a digital archive. And thirdly and finally, I think we need a symposium in Guyana within the next 2 years, pandemic pending, to bring together to see where we can take this extraordinary artist's work. Thank you for hosting this. I hope this is the beginning of something.
Thank you.
Thanks, yes. Thanks for hosting this on Philip Moore. And I feel honored to be on the panel with people like Stanley Graves, who was my lecturer at university, and Dennis that I'm meeting for the first time in this series, in this discussion. I support the idea the ideas that have been said, and it is something that needs to be done. Probably as Guyana is entering this new phase of a different kind of economic development, we can turn our attention to the underpinnings of our culture, the kinds of things that we need to make sure are in place that probably we didn't have the time to think about, and the kind of history that I was tracing. It is still a struggle, because we still have a sense of where social and economic progress lies in what kind of culture, and we still have a kind of backward sense of the other aspects of our cultures. So I'm hoping that the kinds of discussions that will now come up as Guyana charts its way into the new kind of future will help us to tap into all of these things and bring some kind of renewed energy that will allow us to focus more. I believe there are probably now more persons who there's more fertile ground for these ideas to now take root, and hopefully there will be a bit more wherewithal in terms of cash to get these things done. So there is hope.
Thank you. We had one last question from a Ros Gomes, I think on Facebook, asking if Philip was a friend of Martin Carter's. Stanley? Did Philip know Martin?
Philip knew Martin, yes. Yes. Well, I don't know that they ever met to have any lengthy discussions.
Alim, you're nodding?
I agree with Stanley. I think he knew him, but I'm not sure they had any kind of interaction or discussion. I'm not in terms of philosophical exchanges or that.
Difficult.
Yeah.
Right.
That would have been great. That would have been fantastic.
Well, here of two giants of the monologue against one another. Oh man.
Yeah.
I want a front row seat.
Yeah. That would have been fantastic. Yeah.
I just gonna, do I see a hand being raised? Sorry, is that Dr. Brown? Yes? Sorry, looks like, yes, I think I've unmuted you. Yes.
Well, it's really, I don't have any knowledge of whether they knew each other, but among the slides that you showed at the beginning, one of them was called Masks of either
The Masking of Martin, yes.
And when I saw it, I wondered if there was, if there was that connection, or there was another Martin that we knew who that was relating to.
That occurred to me as well. Sorry?
Martin Luther King.
Okay. Right.
Yes, thank you, Alim.
There we go. This is the benefit of many minds as opposed to, as opposed to one. I wondered exactly the same thing when I saw it, because it seemed, and I stand to be corrected here, but it seemed to me that was still in Philip's possession at the end of his life. That particular sculpture. Looks like Jocelyn has some light to shed. Jocelyn?
Hi. Well, the Masking of Martin is actually an interesting piece because it was actually sold to, I think it was Arnold Gibbons and his wife, who was French. And she bought it and said to them she never wanted it to leave Guyana. And left it. It was in fact a Carolot for a long time. Then Philip went up to university in Mississippi, and he took it there and left it there for several years, much to my annoyance, because it was a firm commitment that it would always return to Guyana. Anyhow, it took quite a while, and he got it back it was a university in Tullaguire. I wasn't sure, I can't remember the name, but he then brought it back and he took it home. And he took it home and he meant to carve the back out to have many pieces cast in the same image. And when he was in his last years, it was with him in the quarantine. And I used to say, Philip, this thing, it had a different undertaking. Anyhow, much to my surprise, I saw it on Facebook the other day, and it turns out that a friend of mine now owns it. But I said, from what I know. So I had a long discussion with her that this thing either should go to the museum, but it was meant to be. When he said it was the Masking of Martin, he thought about it in the face of Malcolm X, all the Martin M's he could think of, who Marcus Garvey, Martin, and so on, was what he intended that mask to represent. These great figures that had been liberation strugglers.
Right.
And that was it. So that's what the basking of Martin. So in
Okay.
a way that it could fit into many molds. So it's actually right here again. I'm not there. But there's one other thing, Isabel.
Yeah.
You know, there was a huge collection of his written works. Philip wrote behind all of his stuff, and he kept diaries of things. When he died, we went to Berbice and tried to have a collection made of it, and to suggest that we could pay for it. But it really needed archivists and people. I don't know what has happened to it. But in fact, with the idea that Dennis has in mind, I think it would be a great thing. The first person that brought Philip Moore to Georgetown was, in fact, Ellen Tate. When she was working as a labor welfare officer in the quarantine, she quote unquote discovered Philip. And he loved that place, which is now Carol Lodge.
Yeah.
And in fact, when Carol Lodge was made, I had him do the dedication. So his name is up there in a plaque. He did the dedication of it in the 90s. Of course, it was really, I mean, at least Georgetown was a little nonplussed that Philip would be the man dedicating this new place. But his connection to there was very, very strong.
Right.
And I would like to suggest, Alim, that perhaps we could think of using the hotel as the beginning of something for the kind of symposium that Dennis is talking about, and see how we could work it out when, you know, flight is normal and so on. So
Yes,
I would like that commitment to that.
Okay.
Right?
Thank you. Thank you very much for that suggestion. Okay, I think that we may have to, there are still some comments and questions, but we have been going now for 2 hours, and that is our limit traditionally. So I am going to just wrap things up at this point. I would like to extend particular thanks to Castellani House and Ohini for graciously providing key images for this event, and to others who made images available from their private collections. Thank you too to Hannah and Joan, who've worked behind the scenes to help us. I think they've certainly one of them's been stymied slightly by the eternal blackout. And a final word of thanks to our speakers tonight. We deeply appreciate their guidance in this first encounter with Philip Moore and his cosmos. If you enjoyed the event and would like to be added to our mailing list, please contact us at morehousetrust@gmail.com or via our Facebook page. Thank you again for joining us this evening, and good night. I'm going to end the live feeds now.